What is going on, everybody? Welcome back. It is Dawg Talk with your host, Holden. Hope everybody's doing good today. Glad to have you guys back here as we get geared up for another episode 2 of Season 4, getting underway. We've got plenty to talk about. We've got some fun stuff that we're going to talk about tonight to kind of keep things lively and moving along, so we don't really get wrapped up in, I guess really the best way to say is just kind of the monotony of just boredom in the off season, because there are times where you kind of get into now, right before we get into season, right before we get into fall camp, where things can tend to get boring. There's not a ton to talk about. I mean, I don't do a lot on recruiting, so if you're not talking a bunch about recruiting right now, you don't have a whole lot to talk about. You know, again, it's just getting geared up for the season. But we've got some fun stuff we're going to talk about. We're going to do the normal, the running through the SEC rankings and what we think that they're going to be this season. That's just kind of the play into what everybody does, which is what it is. But nonetheless, we're going to do it because I enjoy doing it. I enjoy kind of talking about who we think and how we think some of these teams are going to line up as the season goes. And then the main topic of this episode is going to be something kind of fun. It's just going to be the top 5 greatest games that I have ever watched. And this is only going to span over the last 10 years. And I do that just to kind of keep it simple over the last 10 years, because previous to 10 years ago, you know, you get into 2012 and a few years before that, there are some good games in that time. But really the bulk of the games that have been in my time of truly watching Georgia and paying attention to what the Dogs have been doing has really been over the last 10 to 12 years, I would say. Really since 2006, but really more focused on like the last 10 years, where I've been paying even more attention than I generally would have. And there have been some elite football games that have been played over the last 10 years. So we're going to go over that. That's going to be kind of fun. We're going to talk a little bit about the offensive line, some standout players coming into this season. And we're also going to talk about the running back room. That's what we're going to get to this week. So let me get the business out of the way, as you'll see it scrolling across the top of the screen up there as we go. Make sure you guys follow us on Twitter at Dawg Talk 20 or X, whatever it's going to be called now. I don't know what they're going to call it now. I don't know what Elon's plan is over there, but if they still call it Twitter at Dawg Talk 20, when it turns to X, we're still going to be at Dawg Talk 20 unless something changes. Instagram, as you see up there in the corner, is the same way at Dawg Talk 20. You can check that out. And then make sure you guys are following along with us there on YouTube as well. We would greatly appreciate that. So let's get into the show. Like I said, we're going to talk about the SEC rankings to kind of get things rocking and rolling, how we think that the SEC is going to shape up this season. Again, some of this is just normal talk of, okay, well, that's normal. It's SEC East, SEC West. It can be kind of boring to some people. I understand that. To me, it's not. I think it's fun kind of talking about it. One thing I want to emphasize right here off the top, if this camera cuts off, which it is bound to do, I'm looking at it now here on YouTube. It's got some weird latency stuff happening. I don't know why it keeps doing this. I've got things that have been working really well, and then sometimes they just stop. They stop acting the way that they're supposed to. So if it cuts out, I may cut the feed, but the audio, all of that stuff, we're just going to keep rocking and rolling with. So if there are technical difficulties, we apologize, but stick with us. And podcast, you won't know anything ever happened because I'll cut all of it out. But anyways, getting into what we've got preseason East and preseason West predictions, and kind of what we're thinking things are going to line up for these predictions as we go throughout the season. We're going to start off looking at the SEC West, I think mainly just because I want to start off looking on that side of the field and what's going to be happening over on the SEC West. It's not necessarily something that I would say is like groundbreaking, but this is how I think it's going to line up. Looking at the West here, and I have seen so many different people put these in all different orders. I have some teams that are closer to the top that you would not expect. I have some teams that are, I think, going to finish much worse than other teams think that they are, other people think that they are. And all of this is, again, it's all opinion. I could literally put Auburn at the top of this just to make a talking head go nuts about it, but we're not going to do that. It doesn't have to be perfect. The possibility of this being perfect is very slim. And at first I was like, all right, well, let me just put these teams where I think they're going to land. And when I started doing that, I was like, okay, so the first list that I kind of put out, I didn't put it out, but I did this. I was like, okay, I kind of line these teams up. And then I actually went in through the season and started to rank them based on win-losses in the SEC. Obviously, outside of the SEC, these rankings don't matter, but head-to-heads matter a lot in these games. And when I actually did that, it kind of swayed a couple of these where, I think some of these teams are much more – they have much more senior. I mean, they got a lot more seniors. They're a little bit more talented. They have more veteran guys that are on their teams, and that's why I have a couple of these teams a little bit higher. So starting at the top, I think LSU does run it back as SEC West division winners. This is going to go away after this year, so that's going to be a little bit different. But I do have LSU finishing at the top of the West again. And I don't have the win-losses on here. I'll pull that back up at some other point in time. But I do have LSU at the top here. Alabama right behind them at 2, Arkansas at 3, which is something that most people aren't going to put there. But KJ Jefferson, some of the guys that they have coming back for Arkansas, I think is going to make them more successful than some other teams think that they will be. Again, Arkansas hasn't done a lot lately. They've had a couple of good seasons. A couple of years ago they came to Athens undefeated, top 10 for the first time in a long time. I just have them a little bit higher than most would, mainly because I do not believe in Texas A&M. I do not believe in Auburn right now. I know it's first year under Hugh Freeze. Anything can happen. Absolutely. I don't think it happens this year. I really don't. I've got Mississippi State behind that. A lot of people are sleeping on Mississippi State. A lot of people are saying that Mississippi State's not going to be very good. Most of the rankings that I've seen, people have Mississippi State at the bottom, and maybe this is just a little bit of my hopefulness, and a lot of it's because of Will Rogers. I've talked about him on this podcast for the past 4 years that I think he's a great football player. He's about to break a bunch of SEC records this year if he stays healthy, and passing yards and all of that good stuff because he's been there for so long. But regardless, I feel like Mississippi State can be successful, and I think they're going to be playing for a lot this year. Everything that happened at the end of last season with Coach Leach, I feel like sometimes that just puts a little bit of a chip on your shoulder and just kind of makes you want to play your heart out, for your previous coach. And it's a sad situation overall, but I feel like that does somewhat impact what's going to happen this season. I've got Ole Miss right behind them. I still think Ole Miss is going to be good, and they're liable to, I think you could kind of swap them maybe even up to the third position. Really 3, 4, 5, to me, you can kind of interchange all three of them, and a lot of it's going to depend on how they play when they play each other. But again, I'm not buying into A&M. And I'm not buying into first year Hugh Freeze at Auburn. So it routes out Arkansas 3rd, Mississippi State 4th, Ole Miss 5th, Texas A&M 6th, and Auburn in the 7th spot. So that's kind of how I have things lining up. Again, these preseason polls, we'll talk about it with Hunter when we get him on here in a couple of weeks. They don't matter. They don't matter at all. It's just something for us to talk about and something for us to somewhat, I guess you could say, enjoy, which I think for some people it's not all that enjoyable. But to me, it is. Again, you just kind of look at these, and especially when you start looking at these teams and how they're going to line up when they're playing each other. And then when I actually got to how they finished the season, their records, I was like, oh, well, this kind of makes a lot of sense here. And why would I not rank them this way? Anything can happen. Anything can change. One team can get good. One team can fall right off the map. It's just part of it. So, that's football. But top 3 there, I've got LSU, Alabama, and Arkansas being the surprise coming in that 3rd spot there. But that's what I've got on the West. Let's jump over to the East and kind of keep this thing rocking and rolling here. Pretty simple. I think no matter how many times I've gone through the East trying to see how the East will line up, I keep getting this same exact ranking right here, 1 through 7. That's Georgia at the top again. I think the hardest game on Georgia's schedule is going to be Week 12 against Tennessee. I think the hardest game on Tennessee's schedule is going to be Week 12 against Georgia. It's in Knoxville. I think it's all going to come down to that for the East this year. But nonetheless, I still have Georgia at the top of that until Tennessee can prove that they belong there. And right now, I don't see that happening with Georgia. And we're going to talk about some of these reasonings behind this later on in this episode, which is just the guys that we still have on this football team. Quarterback's changing, yes, but the guys that are still on this team leads me in every way to believe that Georgia can do exactly what they did last year. Again, at least running through the SEC in general. East, West doesn't really matter. I don't think anybody that you line up in front of Georgia in the SEC this year is going to hinder that, with exception to Tennessee. LSU could catch fire enough to where at the end of the year, if we were able to keep these predictions the way that they are, Georgia and LSU in the SEC championship game again, which is the way I have it lined up. If that was to happen again, I think LSU could catch enough fire to make it a very difficult game. But I do think, luckily, right before it, you have that Tennessee game in Week 12 before playing Georgia Tech, and I think that is kind of the precursor to what you're going to see in the SEC championship game as well, if that's the way that it lines up. I don't have Alabama being as good as they are this year. Again, I'm not going to harp on this very long. I'm going to hit on it very quickly. Without Bryce Young last year, Alabama loses 4 games. That's just my opinion. Everybody's entitled to one. We all got a butthole. This is how my granddad always said it. Everybody's got a butthole, and opinions are just like them. Everybody's got one. So I kind of messed that up. But regardless, that's the way that I feel about it. And I think that this year is going to be similar. I think they're going to struggle. I don't think that they're going to be a bad football team. But going to Texas or having Texas come to them, I think Texas is still going to be a really good football team this year, right before they come to the SEC next year. I think that's going to be a big game in Bryant-Denny, Week 2, or maybe they're playing in Orlando. No, I don't think they are. I think that's in Bryant-Denny. Regardless, that's going to be a really big game, Week 2. But then LSU, I think they're going to edge Alabama again. Again, I don't see Alabama being that top dog in the West this season. Now, give it a couple of years, they may get back up there. But right now, this is how I have it lining up in the East. As you see right there, Georgia at 1, if you guys are watching on YouTube at least. Georgia at 1, Tennessee 2, South Carolina 3. I think South Carolina is going to be really good this year. When I was doing it, I actually only see a couple of losses on South Carolina's schedule. This is all based off of how South Carolina finished their season last year. The fact that they took Tennessee down and then they took Clemson down. Yes, they fell to Notre Dame in the postseason, or not really postseason, but you know what I'm saying, bowl season. They do fall to Notre Dame then, but I don't think that's going to hinder what's going on. Shane Beamer, I mean, you got to give him credit. The dude, I mean, he coaches with passion for sure. I don't think South Carolina has enough to get over Georgia this year. I think Tennessee's going to have a chip on their shoulder coming into that game, much like Georgia has had a chip on their shoulder playing Tennessee the past few years as well, and trying to continue that dominance over them. So that's going to be a big game as well. But these top 3 teams, I think, is going to be 3 of the best teams in the SEC altogether right here. That is, again, if South Carolina can play the way that they did at the end of last season. Kentucky, a little bit of a step back year here. They still finish in the middle of the pack of the East. Florida does not look good. Honestly, 5 and 6, Florida and Missouri, it could be an interchangeable with them. The first ranking I actually did have Florida at the very bottom, but I was like, all right, I don't think they're going to be that bad. They're not going to be a good football team this year. I don't think Missouri is either. I know Missouri gave Georgia a run for their money last year, but that was all they did. That was it. And then Vanderbilt had a great year last year. I think Clark Lee is doing good things there at Vanderbilt, but they've got a lot to prove to me that they will be a team to compete in the SEC East anytime soon. Again, we go back to 2016, Vanderbilt's beating Georgia. You know, it could take a game like Georgia played against Missouri last year and playing Vandy in that kind of style, and all of a sudden we're in a game that we shouldn't be in. That can happen. Again, any given Saturday, anything can happen in the SEC. Anything can happen in college football, which is kind of wild, but that's how I rank, whatever you want to say. I'm trying to think of the way that I predicted. Prediction is actually what it is there. It's not really a ranking. This isn't a true preseason ranking. It's not a true preseason poll. None of that. It's just my prediction on how I think the season's going to go. And there at the top of the East, I got Georgia, Tennessee, South Carolina in those positions. If you look at them side by side here, this will kind of give you a snapshot of how I feel things are going to line up. And I'll tweet this out after this episode and get it out there so that way everybody and their mama can fuss about why in the world do you think that this is how this is going to line up. Again, hey, everybody's entitled to their own opinion, and that's what we're going to do. We're going to enjoy that and kind of go from it in that way. So that's what we got, SEC East, SEC West predictions. So I'm looking forward to it. I think if a lot of these things kind of line up the way that they, to me look like they possibly could, I think that this may actually be like a really fun season. I think the SEC East is going to end up being the top dog in the SEC this year. I think Georgia, Tennessee, and again, I think South Carolina is actually going to have a really good season this year. Again, barring that they play the way they did at the end of last season. If they can do that, I think they're going to be a really good football team. And then in the West, I think LSU is going to be good this year. I don't really like giving credit to them, but I almost said Brian Kelly there at LSU. He's doing a good job. Year one, is it luck? Maybe. But year two, I mean, he is at a program where he can get the guys that he wants and compete in the SEC, and he can compete for an SEC championship. And if you're competing for an SEC championship in high caliber, you have a great chance of making it to the college football playoffs as time rolls on. So let's get to really the fun segment of this season, or of this episode here. Season 4, Episode 2 of Dawg Talk. As we get into it here, top 5 greatest games that I've watched really over the last 10 years is the parameters that I gave it here. This first one, I'm going to start with number 5. Not really a big one as far as like it was a big game for sure. It's a very big game. I don't remember this game quite as much. Like I started kind of looking back, and I was like, man, I don't remember this game as much as I thought I did, because for whatever reason I was putting this game. I was thinking this was like 2007. I was thinking this was much earlier on, but this happened in 2013. But I don't have the biggest memory of this game. Obviously, Georgia comes off of a 2012 season that was a great season. Right there at playing for a national championship. All you got to do is beat the foe over in the West, and you play Notre Dame. And the way that Notre Dame got thrashed in that, Georgia was liable to have been able to do the same thing. In that, but then the next year, it wasn't nearly as great of an ending to the Aaron Murray era at all. But it was still a pretty good year, and LSU was a good football team that year, and that was just a big game in Athens. Fun nonetheless. Either way you look at it. Again, if this video cuts out here, hopefully it won't, but it's starting to kind of jump on us here. You guys just try to kind of bear with me here, and I'll see if I can get it back up and going here in just a minute. Sometimes things just kind of act like that on you. So I do apologize for you guys watching on YouTube, but nonetheless, we'll jump to number 4. This was a huge game. Over in the it's not the SEC. It's not the SECs. It's not the SEC rankings, obviously. But this was a huge game in general for Georgia. This was another one the following year that we actually got to play in Athens, which was a lot of fun, that 2018 season. But this 2017 season, having to go up to Notre Dame and play in South Bend, that was a huge game. Kind of back and forth. Wasn't a high-scoring game, but it was still a fun game to watch. I think this was the game that Godwin caught the big number 5. Godwin catches it. I can't think of his first name right now. Catches it in the end zone, stretching out. Such a good play. I've seen a lot of paintings and everything of that, but this was such a good football game, leading up to just such a good season. One of the other parameters that I did do in these top 5 games watched was also, it can't be a game that we lost, because I just feel like that wouldn't be very fun, would it? If I put a game that Georgia lost in these rankings, to me it's not necessarily fair to put a game that Georgia loses in the rankings. So that's the number 4 that I've got there. Number 4, 2017 Georgia at Notre Dame. That one finals out 20-19. Such a big game there. Again, leading into that kind of a dream 2017 season that unfortunately ended in not such a dreamy way. All right, and kind of back into things here. Moving on to that number 3 position there. Again, coming off number 4 there, the 2017 Georgia at Notre Dame, which, again, was a big one. We moved to number 3. This was such a great one. Again, this is where we date back to the big one, the first big one for us in a really long time. That's number 3. That's the 2021 National Championship game versus Alabama. Such a big football game. I mean, you don't need me to tell you just how big of a football game it was, just because, again, national championship for the first time in forever. That was such a huge thing. But the fact that you finally got over the hump, playing a team that you just haven't beat in a long time, really long time, had been trying to get over that hump, and it wasn't happening. It was not happening. That's all there is to it. And we finally did that. And I really wish over the past year, even in this past national championship, a lot of me kind of wish we would have got that opportunity to do it again because, again, you just want the opportunity to play the team that thinks that they're their best. And when you don't get to, excuses are made. So I'd like to shut those up. Maybe we'll get that opportunity sometime this year or maybe in the years coming. But number 3, top 5 games watched over the past 10 years. I do have that 2021 National Championship game beating Alabama 33-18, which, again, huge game. It's not the top game for me. There are a lot of other games that were really good. And score-wise, as far as it goes, that wasn't necessarily as close of a game. But you guys know if you look at the score, it's like 33-18. Oh, that's a pretty good. That's a pretty good game. And it's like, it is. It really was. Some teams would think, oh, y'all blew them out. No. If you watch it, like if you look back on this game 40 years after it's happened and you see the score and you weren't there, you didn't witness it, you're like, man, Georgia did good in that game. And they did, for sure. But this was a very close football game. Up until the very end when we score another touchdown to go up, because you got to think we're only up on them by 8. We're only up by 8 as we crack down right under a couple of minutes left to play in the game before Georgia goes up 33-18, which is what it ended up finaling out as. So moving on to number two, I have to go with this last year. This was such an elite game. The 2022 Peach Bowl versus Ohio State. I've gone back and forth. I really think I've probably watched the national championship game from 2022 season about as much as I've watched this, because this was, to me, the actual play-in national championship game. The Michigan-TCU game was a good football game. TCU did their job. They got to the national championship game. This right here was like a national championship, because you had Georgia literally within the last couple of minutes of the game taking the lead in a game that Georgia was down, and then they came back and tied it. Georgia was down. They came back and got back in the game. Georgia was down again, and they came back and were in this football game. But it was back and forth for a good little while there. And, again, Ohio State pulls away. Georgia comes back. You guys know this off the miracle, not a miracle, but just the greatness of the back-to-back season was this past year. To come back in that game, take the lead, and then as the clock strikes midnight on New Year's, the field goal being no good, and Georgia winning that game 42-41. This is probably one of the games that my heart took a toll that I may not see until I'm a little bit older. But this was one of those games that I never really knew if we were going to win the game. There are a couple other games that we've played that I was like, this is a tight game. Makes you nervous and everything, but I feel like Georgia's going to pull it out. This was one I really didn't know. Going down 14 one time, it was like, man, coming back from that, awesome. But then going down by 14 again, and could have been more than that at one point. It was like, we may be asking for a lot here. We may be asking for a lot coming back. But such a good game, 42-41. The end of it is when the thrill really happened for Georgia, because for most of that game, it wasn't all that thrilling, with the exception to the comebacks. When we would come back, get back in the game, or tied up, or be right there, within scoring distance, right within striking distance. But those couple of times we got down big, that wasn't fun. But the end of this, again, the exhilaration, taking the lead, thinking, oh my goodness, we just got the lead finally, and we're at the end of this football game, and can we hold it? And then them driving right down the field and literally being a field goal away from winning that game, and things being completely different for the history books that Georgia placed last year. So that is my number 2. And you may be thinking, okay, well, what in the world game could possibly top that? Because that was a huge one. And it's this one. I still have not found a game that, to me, watching it, was better than the 2017 Rose Bowl versus Oklahoma. Again, this is the past 10 years. I'm not going back to the 80s. I'm not going back to the 90s. Again, I wasn't watching football I wasn't alive in the 80s, but I wasn't watching football in the 90s unless I was just a baby watching, or a kid at one point by the time we got to the late 90s. But I wasn't paying attention to it like I do now. Again, really, I started picking up football where I was like, okay, this is enjoyable in like 2006, and really started rooting on the Dawgs 2007, 8, and moving on, and then started getting into truly watching, probably 2008-ish, 9, somewhere around in there, where I really started like, okay, these Dogs, especially the Matt Stafford, that was really, and that's why I put him in so many different rankings that Hunter and I have done, and just rankings in general that I've done, is because it was such a big deal to me what Matthew Stafford did for Georgia as far as being a player, but it was also kind of my introduction into watching college football regularly like I do now. So, again, that's just kind of talking about the parameters of why I put it this. But past 10 years, top 5 game. This is the top game that I have ever watched. It was another one where, again, we're down bad, and right before the half, we kick a field goal to kind of cut into that lead, but Georgia just would not give up. We kept fighting back. The fact that Nick Chubb, the fact that Sony Michel, come back for their senior seasons, we're doing everything we can. Again, this was a dream season that unfortunately did not end in the way we wanted it to, but it was still a dream season. This was our first bid getting into the college football playoffs in 2017. Jake Fromm, the year that he had as a freshman, huge, helping carry this team to where they were. And again, those running backs doing everything that they did to get us in this game, and then ending on the wild dog is what I call it, but the wildcat with Sony Michel around the left side, right in the end zone. The fact that we blocked the field goal, too, that's so huge to keep them off of the board, and then we turn around and score a touchdown to finish it all 54-48 in double overtime. I mean, you couldn't have asked for a better game, especially one that's a college football playoff game. This is getting you into the national championship game if you win this game, and Georgia did. I don't think too many people necessarily thought that Georgia would, but they did. Georgia was such a good football team that year. Again, you come up short, but this is the greatest game that I have watched Georgia play with my own eyes, whether it's there, whether it's on TV or not. I'm watching this on TV. I wasn't at the Rose Bowl, but this game was huge. Watching it with friends, and, you go nuts when these games like this happen. We went nuts at New Year's when we beat Ohio State. That's why it's at number 2. That's not the whole reason. I mean, it's just a great football game. What if the game had the implications that did over the past 10 years? Heck, really, over the past 20 years. What other game had that same implication? When this game go to the national championship game? 2012. Again, that's out of the parameters. And again, we lost that game. 2012 SEC championship game. You're 5 yards away from playing for a national championship, possibly winning your first since 1980 back in 2012, and it didn't happen. We almost get that chance this season right there in 2017 after winning that Rose Bowl. Couldn't do it then either. Finally, we turn around and do it in 21 and 22. So it's been a long road, but that to me was the top game that I've watched over the last 10 years. Huge game, 2017 Rose Bowl over Oklahoma, 54-48 in double overtime. Such a fun game. Again, I enjoyed kind of trying to figure out this list or figure out exactly where do I put these games? Where would I rank them? Who do I want, to be sitting at the top of this? And I kind of went back and forth on a couple of them, but in the end, I still have not. I mean, first of all, it's my poll, so it can be whatever I want it to be. But this, to me, still, it trumps playing Michigan in the college football semifinal game the year before, 34-11. It trumps that Peach Bowl last year against Ohio State. It trumps all of those great games we had in 2017. And, again, I could probably change the parameters and say, okay, let me open it up to the last 15 years. Let me open it up to the last 20 years. And let me also open it up to losses, because there are plenty of games. I mean, national championship game 2017, great football game, lost it. That was the first time that I'd ever truly watched a football game and just been sad about a football game, like to the point where I was like, why am I sad about a football game that means nothing to me? It doesn't change my life in any way. But nonetheless, I was. And I think a lot of you guys were too. So that's my line. Hope you guys enjoyed that at least. Let's kind of get into some of the other stuff that I did want to talk about as we kind of rock into it real quick. Yeah, you couldn't hear that at all, could you? There we go. And we're going to talk about the stout offensive line that Georgia's got this year. This is the reason that I have Georgia finishing number 1 in the SEC East. Not only looking at the schedule that everybody's going to tell you is a cupcake, and Kirby Smart's going to tell you, hey, come and play it, big boy. Everybody's going to tell you these things, but there is a reason behind it. There's a reason that Georgia is going to finish at the top of the SEC East. And the only team, to me, in my opinion, that is standing in their way, it's not South Carolina. South Carolina is not standing in Georgia's way yet. If you look at the past few years, how Georgia has handled South Carolina, I don't see it being a threat. If you look at the past few years that Georgia has handled Tennessee, you would say I don't see a threat, but they are the biggest threat that I see. And yes, you can look back last year and say, yes, but Georgia has also handled Missouri, and they didn't this year. They didn't this past year. They let Missouri hang out right there with them. Regardless, I just don't see a team. Week 12 is the 1 week circled on the calendar. And I know you're supposed to say, hey, you need to circle Auburn. Auburn can always do something. Auburn's not going to do anything this year. I don't care if it's in Jordan Hare or not. Yeah, there was the prayer in Jordan Hare, but that team had more talent on it than the team that Hugh Freeze has adopted this season. It's not the same. I'm not saying Auburn doesn't have some dudes. They do. Every team in the SEC has some dudes. You're the SEC, the best conference in the country, so you're going to have some dudes on the team. But all of the games that I look at on the schedule, I just don't see how Georgia struggles with them. Georgia's at home against South Carolina. We're not at South Carolina. We have to go to Neyland. That's going to be the toughest part about having to play Tennessee this coming season. Everybody talks about, oh, Joe Milton can throw the ball 95 yards. Okay, can he do it with a Georgia defender in his face all night long? We're going to find that out. Week 12, we got a long way to go before we figure that out. And you're going to know as we walk through the season, I hope by the time we get to week 12, you've got 2 undefeated teams sitting there. My rankings, the way that I did it, you didn't see it on the screen because I didn't put how I think their record will be at the end of the season. I think that's what happens. I think we get to week 12, and Tennessee is an undefeated team. I think that Tennessee beats Alabama again this year, shutting down something that happened last year, and they come in ready to rock and roll in Knoxville week 12 of the season when Georgia comes knocking on the back door. And I cannot wait because by that time, a lot of stuff can happen. Injuries can happen. We're not going to count on that. We're going to count on we got the team that we have walking in the door. And even if you have injuries, because I'm not going to make the excuses, if you got injuries, the next man has to come up. The next man has to make the play. He's got to fill the shoes of whoever's before him. And that's one of the things about this stout O-line that we're about to talk about and all these standout players that we're about to talk about as well. Georgia still has dudes lined up on both sides of the football. We got Carson Beck that's about to be the quarterback for us that I believe in right out of the bat, right off the shoot. I believe in the dude. And some of that is because we have doubted quarterbacks in the past, Stetson Bennett, and he has still made the plays. He has still done the job. Is Todd Monken not here? No, Mike Bobo's there. We're going to have to see how this thing works with him, but I don't doubt it because of all of the guys that we have surrounding him. I started going through this, looking at the standout players that we're about to talk about, looking at this O-line that we're about to talk about. We're going to talk about 5 guys. 5 guys. Juniors and seniors, that's all of them. Cedric Von Prine Granger, Amaris Mims, Tate Ratledge, Xavier Truss. All 5 of these dudes simply can go to the NFL next year. Every single one of them can. Should they? Very well possible. Very well possible that all of them do. But you've got this kind of an O-line that's about to stand in front of a quarterback who hasn't played that many snaps. Carson Beck has not had all that many snaps in his season or in his tenure as being on Georgia's team, and he's a junior. But nonetheless, he's got the best offensive line in the country. In the country. You heard me say that, Michigan. We have the best offensive line in the country. This is just 5 dudes in the upper class. You still have other guys that are below him that are going to be sitting there blocking for him too. That's the O-line. We're going to talk about running back room here in just a minute, but we're just talking about the O-line right here. Best offensive line in the country alone. It starts in the trenches, especially from what I know in the past of Georgia playing with a Mike Bobo offense. It starts in the trenches because I've always known Mike Bobo to run the ball. We're real run heavy. I don't think that's going to happen this season. I think we're still going to air the ball out, but you have got some dudes who are going to allow Carson Beck to do that, which I'm excited about. Stout O-line. We get to some standout players. I'm going to try to start off offensively and then go to the other side of the ball. First name that should come out of anybody's mouth when it comes to standout players at the University of Georgia is Junior Brock Bowers at tight end because he is the best player on the football team. The best football player on the football team right now. There's nobody else. There are dudes on the defense that I'm not trying to take credit from because we got some stout guys on defense too, and we're going to talk about them in just a minute. But Brock Bowers is where it starts. Kirby Smart tells you this every year. How do you win? With the offense that you have in place, you give your key players the ball. You find a way to get them the ball, and you will be successful. Every time you get Brock Bowers the ball, Georgia is successful. So Brock Bowers being one of the first guys. Ladd McConkey, I don't have to say anything else as far as that goes either, because you know how Ladd's been over the past couple of years. Ladd's another guy. Arian Smith, I think if he can stay healthy, he is the fastest dude in college football. He has been in the past couple of years, and he has the opportunity to do that. He has the opportunity to take the top off the defense, and that happened a couple of times this past year, especially late in the season when he was getting healthy. We were able to take the top off even more on defenses, which is huge. And I think if he is healthy throughout this season, he adds so much to this offense. We have other wideouts. Dylan Bell, only a sophomore. He had flashes this past season, even coming into the spring. Looks like he could be another one of those dudes where it's like, I can go any direction I need to with this. I got guys that I can throw it to left and right. I got Ladd. I got Brock. I got Oscar Delp over here in the tight end position as well. I got Dylan Bell out here. I got Marcus Rosemary, Jack Saint. I got dudes on the outside. So now all of a sudden we're looking at an offense like this. Best offensive line in the country. You got wideouts to throw the ball to. You got Carson Beck, who hasn't proven himself necessarily back there yet. He's about to get that opportunity to, but he's got everybody to block for him. He's got guys to throw it to. Now let's get to the running back room. One of the biggest rooms in the country. And in past, there's always a name. There's a name. You got Nick Chubb. Oh, you got Ty Gurley. Oh, y'all got Sony Michel. Oh, you got DeAndre Swift. Elijah Holyfield's back there. You got guys. Okay? And last year, the big guy was Kenny McIntosh. He's gone. Kendall Milton has been sitting there, though. He's been battling some adversity. He's been battling some injury. But Kendall Milton's been sitting there ready, chomping at the bit. And the end of last year when he started coming back, getting healthy again, you started to see it. You started to see that hunger, that drive starting to come back, and it was like, okay, we got another dude that's going to be here next year that's going to continue to eat. And the same thing with Dejon Edwards. He's stuck around, staying, and he's going to do the same thing. That dude's hungry each and every single week. He's here to eat. He's ready to rock and roll with this team as well. You got two dudes right there. It's not a lot. You're not putting up the most yardage in a career. Both of these guys are seniors. Both of these guys will be gone after this season, but both of them putting up over 1,000 yards, over 10 touchdowns each between receiving and rushing. Both of these dudes are good running backs. They're not guys who are going to show up and they've got 4,000 and 5,000 yards under their belt as a running back. They don't. Georgia is so good at keeping guys healthy, and I think that benefits them in the future when it comes to the NFL, because you got these guys who, instead of having to carry the load for the entire team, they're splitting it. They're splitting reps, and that doesn't work for everybody. I was reading something earlier that if you're coming to Georgia, whether a transfer or you're coming there committing, you need to know what you're getting into with the University of Georgia, and it doesn't work for everybody. And that's so true, because if you're not willing to split carries and keep yourself healthy, as you can be anyway, but fresh legs getting in there with these running backs, if you're coming here and you want to have 5,000-yard season all by yourself, I hate to say it, but the University of Georgia is not for you. University of Georgia is not the place you need to come, because you're going to get split carries with other dudes, but it's going to keep you healthy. It's going to keep you to me, it extends the career that you can have in the NFL. That's my opinion. Could I be wrong about that? Absolutely. But that's the way that I look at it. Then you got a sophomore in Branson Robinson, who is just a train of a guy that we got to see some last year. Flashes of him last year that was just elite. And that's not even talking about Savon Clark, that we got to talk about a little bit. Got to see him very slightly last year, also a senior. But then you get these freshmen that are coming in, Roderick Robinson, Andrew Paul, who was hurt last year, and then Cass Jones, who is also a sophomore this year. So we've got plenty of running backs, but you've got those head guys. All of a sudden, it's like, okay, we've got some guys who have been here a couple of years. I've been kind of harping more on Dejon Edwards, because he was that bulldoze kind of guy. You had Sony, who was a little bit more shifty and quick, but Nick Chubb, he was like, all right, I'm going to pound you, but I'm also fast too. Then you had the 1-2 punch of DeAndre Swift, who he's that shifty guy, really fast, electric when he gets into the open field. Then you got Elijah Holyfield, who will Herschel Walker run you over hobnail boot right up the middle and take you out. And to me, that's what we've got again. We've got Kendall, who's a shifty dude, fast. Get him into the open field, he's gone. Same thing, Dejon Edwards can do the same thing, but he can run you over as well. And then Branson Robinson's that Elijah Holyfield to me also. He's just going, you're in my way, excuse me, I'm going to just run you right over. So we've got dudes in the running back room. So when I start to look at this offensively, just looking at the offense, maybe we'll dive more into the defense next week, but just offensively right there, why can't Georgia be successful? And if you think Georgia's defense is about to take a step down, no, sir. No, sir. Georgia proved that after winning the 2021 national championship. And all these dudes left, and all these dudes went to the NFL. And everybody said, Georgia, they've lost some guys. There's going to be some kind of attrition on that back end. Was it the same defense in 2022? No. I'll give credit to that as far as the media goes, saying that it's not going to be as good as it was the year previous. It wasn't. I agree. But are you telling me that team still was not elite on defense and is going to be that same way this year regardless of what we've lost? We've lost a lot of guys on defense too, some really good football players. I'm about to name a few for you here. Michael Williams, sophomore. Malachi Starks, sophomore. Both of those dudes made plays for Georgia last season as freshmen. Jalen Walker, sophomore. Same thing. Dude was elite last year. That's just three guys right there coming off of the freshman class into it. Jamon Dumas-Johnson as a junior. Huge. To me, he has so many tendencies that's like a blend of Roquan and the Kobe Dean to me. He just, I don't know what it is. Some of it I think is that presence, but he's got that bull noses to me that Roquan had, you know, where he's cutting across the field. He's getting in every play that he can. I think, is going to be such a good asset again this season. He already was last year. He was already huge last year, and especially when I'm blanking, Smith got hurt. I hate when I do this. I do a Georgia football podcast and blank on people's names all the time. Blame it on my memory. Don't blame it on me just being stupid to knowing what Georgia is. I know the guys. Can't always think of the guys' names. Again, you got a huge roster. I look at a sheet, 4 or 5 different pages of roster for the Georgia Athletics every single season, and you start to kind of pick out, and it's like, all right, these are the big guys. These are the big guys. Last year, Nolan Smith, my goodness, thank you, gets hurt, and, you know, he's on the sideline and everything, but we're not calling his name every single week about plays and what he's doing, this, that, the other. Great football player, nonetheless, great guy. But couldn't think of his name for a minute. Sorry about that. But anyways, that's a couple of guys. Then you got Kamari Lassiter, Smile Munden, Javon Bullard, Tyke Smith here again, which I think that's one, as a senior, I'd kind of forgotten about. You know, he wasn't all that great. Excuse me. Let me stop there. Not going to say he wasn't all that great. We didn't call his name all the time last year. Can't remember if it was for injury, but I remember the year previous he had a lot of plays, and we kept talking about the Smith trio coming back on defense, and we got that. But I do know in the national championship game, you kind of heard his name, and I think he can play a big role in being one of the standout players in this as well. But all these other names, Javon Bullard, Smile Munden, Kamari Lassiter, you heard their name against Ohio State last year. You heard their name throughout the season, but national championship too. Dudes on defense. That's why I look at this schedule. And everybody that calls it a cupcake, call it what you want. Just like Kirby said, come play it. It is what it is. We can't change it. Why are we going to sit here and harp and fuss on what the schedule is? Regardless. Dudes on defense. Dudes on offense. How does it compute with anybody that Georgia cannot do it again this year? I think that's why so many people are looking and they're going, they can. And they probably will. That's all there is to it. So we don't need to talk about it anymore. That's where we're going to wrap this episode up. Again, you guys follow us on Twitter at Dawg Talk 20. Again, I appreciate you guys being here with us. Instagram, YouTube, everywhere that there is to follow us. Make sure you guys do that. On Patreon as well. Patreon.com/Dawg Talk. Make sure you guys go over there and support the show if you want. I would greatly appreciate it. But otherwise, we will check in with you guys next week. Go Dogs.